Hello and welcome to Eyes Open, a podcast about screens and scripture. My name is Chase Hairston. I am a professor of biblical theology and spiritual formation here at Mid-South Christian College in Memphis, Tennessee, and I'll be your host. On season 1 of our show, I, a Bible professor who has never before watched the hit series The Chosen, get introduced to the show by a former student of mine who is a qualified superfan of the show. Today we will be discussing the second episode of season 3 of The Chosen, which shows Jesus telling the disciples he intends to send them out on missionary journeys 2 by 2. We also have our very first guest interview with Dr. Jonathan Pennington, who is Professor of New Testament Interpretation at Southern Seminary in Louisville. All this and more on today's episode, but this is the day. Turn the volume up and rejoice. I hope that sounded okay. I'm a little out of practice on my air guitar, but
Great.
it just comes back to you when you've been as a professional as long as I am. It's like riding a bike, you know. Jacob, it's good to see you again. How are you?
Doing pretty well.
Yeah?
Yeah. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Doing well. Grades, I got all my grades graded. I got all my stuff graded. You can tell it didn't fry my brain at all. Grades submitted on time. Please pat me on the digital back. I did not have to get the email that said, excuse me, you've missed the deadline. Where are your grades? So feeling pretty good about myself, to be perfectly honest with you.
That's pretty nice.
I set the bar pretty low for myself. Listeners, viewers, you'll notice pretty quickly that though Jacob and I are here, and I'm very, very thankful Jacob is, our beloved third voice of Aisha is not here today. She had some traveling to do, and there is rumors of inclement weather that she needed to get out ahead of. So, Aisha, we will miss you. Listeners, we're very sorry. Please set your expectations at a maximum of 2/3 as good as you would have hoped otherwise.
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah. Again, the lower you set the bar, the more satisfied you're able to feel with yourself, even if that's not true for others, but that's okay. We are, as I mentioned, going to discuss episode 2 of season 3 today, which appropriately for episode 2 is called 2 by 2. And we will jump right in. You know, it has been rumored that our first episode clocked in at an hour and 44 minutes long. You know, I can't say I'm surprised that you gave me a microphone and I just kept on talking and talking. But we're gonna try to come in a little under that today. We'll see what we can do.
Yep.
Try
Good
to keep
hour
people
and a
happy.
half.
Yeah, right. I mean, thank you if you listened to all of that. We are pretty confident it was at least a little bit quality content. I'm not that confident. It was good. It was good enough. We're to aim for good today. So let's jump in. Our first segment we're calling Canonical Considerations because we're doing the zoomed out bird's eye view as one might when considering the full canon of Scripture. We're going to talk about the whole episode. How'd you feel, Jacob? Overall impressions of episode 2?
Yeah, I loved episode 2.
Yeah.
Especially when I saw it in theaters, it was amazing to see it back to back from episode 1 right into episode 2. But there's just so many good scenes in this episode. I can't wait to talk about it more.
Yeah. Was there any break, or did it just episode 1 faded to black and then it came up 2?
I think there was like a small bit of the credits, and then it like faded into the next opening, and then we got the opener, like the music, the intro. We got that again.
Oh yeah,
in the second,
which you're not complaining about at all.
I'm not at all. No, it's a great intro.
And tell the people what they want to hear. Did you line up at the movie theater cosplaying as Jesus or as, I don't know, someone else?
No, I did not.
Okay.
No,
well,
it was just
a true fan.
I didn't have time to gather my costume up.
Okay. It was a dirty bed sheet and a rope as a belt. But okay, I'll let you have it. That's fine. Good. Yeah, I bet that was cool in theaters. It'll be nice when we get to episode 3 that we'll be on even playing ground and you have one less thing to hold over me as being better than me. No, I'm kidding. I'm really glad you got to see that in theaters. I'm sure that was a really cool experience. I also thought this was a good episode. I've only got one to compare it to. So 50-50 chance I would have liked it as much, I guess. But it was good. I particularly liked, I guess, to spoiler alert, what I'm going to say 60 seconds from now, the establishing shot, the opening shot of the outside of the city of Capernaum from the sea.
Yeah.
Just, I don't have enough experience or study in terms of cinematography stuff to use the right vocabulary here, but I can say it looked real good and I liked it. I liked the way that it looked. It was pretty.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say. It was pretty. So that's what I have to say. We are going to jump next into our second segment. See, look at that. First segment done. We're moving right through. Second segment we call Lucan Filmography. But let me say before we do, as I mentioned before, we do have our very first guest interview today. We're going to play on this episode of the podcast a short clip of my discussion with Dr. Jonathan Pennington, who, among other books, authored this one called The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing, which obviously is relevant to season 3 of The Chosen. We are going to play a clip of that today, hopefully be able to have a few of Jacob's follow-up thoughts as a response to hearing it for the first time live. But I do want to let listeners know that we are going to release the full interview as its own episode in a couple of days. So keep an eye out for that. If you're not familiar with Jonathan Pennington's work, it is very good. And I was extremely excited and very humbled to be able to talk to him. It was a lot of fun. He's a very smart man. He's been studying the Sermon on the Mount for a very long time, teaching and writing on it as well. So he was the right person to get as our first interview to hear an expert's thoughts on some of the biblical backgrounds behind what we saw on screen in that season premiere episode. So just want to let listeners know, keep an eye out for that full interview coming soon. But with that said, let's jump into what we call Lucan filmography, because taking our cues from the opening of the Gospel of Luke, we aim to do in an orderly sequence our filmography here. We want to work through this episode in an orderly way, more or less scene by scene. So as I mentioned, we get an establishing shot of the city of Capernaum, which shows us that many people who heard Jesus' sermon are sort of hanging out just outside the city limits of Capernaum, hoping to find Jesus, hear more from him. And there's a conversation between the centurion Gaius and the cohortes, who did not get named, but according to IMDb, he is called Atticus.
Yes.
Yeah. So Gaius and Atticus having another of their lovely chats. I like Atticus. I like his snarkiness. He's funny.
Yeah.
And so they discuss this shantytown, this city of tents that's being built, and how there's pretty good likelihood that that's going to ruffle some Roman feathers. And so Atticus tells Gaius, we're going to have to go talk to your boss Quintus about all of this. But before we see them, we get a couple of scenes before we see them do that. The next one is Simon the Zealot and one of the other guys who's an apostle walking through that sort of tent city that night. And I suppose the point of this scene was to show that tensions are rising. Simon the Zealot's a little nervous about all the rules being followed right.
Yeah, so one of the things, and I believe the other disciple is Nathan or something, one of those.
Yeah.
And he, Simon the Zealot is a little bit new to the group still.
I gather that.
And so he's still sort of learning how they do things. And he's sort of not wanting to draw too much attention from the Romans, because he knows as a zealot how bad that could be. But also, like I mentioned in last week's episode, there's already been some run-ins with the Roman government with Jesus. In season 2, Jesus was arrested and brought to Quintus.
Okay, Quintus
For
specifically.
like a questioning.
Okay.
And then released. So they're just trying to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
And as we see later, the Romans are trying to enforce some rule and law and order to this tent city that's been outside of Capernaum.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. I do have one thought. This is called foreshadowing that I'll share later about this scene. So we see that. Next we see Matthew's sort of restoration scene with his family.
Love that scene.
Yeah, it was a good one. In my mind, I'll check my notes here, but I'm pretty sure there were sort of 3 major scenes in this episode, and this is the first of them. Obviously, the season premiere of season 3 sort of began and ended with this story. Opened a few years prior to the main events, where Matthew is disowned by his father Alphaeus, and then has such a good moment that closed with them seeing each other again after the Sermon on the Mountain. We found out in this scene that Alphaeus and Ellie, Matthew's mother, heard the Sermon on the Mount, were very impressed, and so that season 1 ended with Alphaeus just saying, "My son." And you're just like, "Oh yes, this is all I wanted." So we get sort of what happens next here. There's apologies all around. Matthew talks a lot about shame, which seems to be, kind of a through line for him as a character, whether it's the sort of internal world he struggles with, or the very problematic nature of the vocation that he chose as tax collector. Certainly lost him any friendships he may have had before, brought shame upon his parents and their family. So that's obviously something that he wrestles with, but sees some very nice redemption of that shame in this scene, right? I really liked, part of what he's saying as he's trying to apologize is he's very verbally, very obviously wrestling with this, "I've always felt so different." And then towards the end of this scene, as his mom is hugging him and insisting that he call her Ema, which is, the mommy equivalent of the day, where she says, "You are different because you were set aside for something special." Meaning to be one of Christ's followers. Is she and Alphaeus have seemed pretty convinced that he's not just another good rabbi, but he's the Messiah as well. So I thought that was really touching and meaningful in probably ways that I can't quite put my finger on, to take the attention from the portrayal, the way they've portrayed Matthew as with his internal world and his mental world, to say again, to not to negate that, I guess I would say, but to say that's not the true mark of what makes you different, right? What makes you different is that you have been set apart for this. I thought that seemed meaningful, that seemed important, and touching, as I said before.
Yeah. One of the things I love about the scene is when they tell Matthew, "Yeah, we saw him. That's your rabbi," they ask.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I wrote the sermon down. And they're like, "You're his scribe?"
Yeah.
And they get so excited because that's such an honor, right? To be the one who keeps your teacher's notes, right?
Yeah, that's cool.
We're not going to talk about how many notes I kept from your class.
Because you don't want to say none? Is that what you mean?
But it's when shortly after that, she cries, "Matthew, he chose you," which again hints to the title of the series, right? The Chosen.
Right.
And when she runs up to hug him, the camera kind of focuses on him dropping like a handkerchief.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could really tell from the first episode, but throughout the whole series, Matthew's been sort of shown as to be like a germaphobe type. Like he doesn't, like he carries that for comfort, but if he'll open things or he'll grab stuff with his rag instead of with his hand.
Okay.
But he puts that down and then hugs her.
Yeah.
So it's very emotional in that sense.
Yeah, that's cool.
And you can kind of tell that his dad clocks that as well, like sees that change in him.
Yeah. I know. I mean, I could tell that it had something to do with security and comfort, but I didn't pick up on the germaphobe aspect. So that's cool. Yeah. Also in this scene, Alpheus gives him the key to his former home that presumably he was given as being a tax collector.
Yeah. So he was able to buy this really nice house because
he bought it. Okay.
he was really wealthy,
right?
Because he was a tax collector. And when Matthew gets called to leave to follow Jesus, he takes his key and he hands it to Gaius, that Roman centurion from the beginning of the episode. He gives it to him. He says, "Can you give this to my parents?"
All right.
And so he does what he is asked to do, and he takes it to Matthew's parents. And that little bit of like, sell it, burn it, whatever, like that line that he says, that's the same thing the Roman says to him. He's like, I don't care what you do to it.
Oh, interesting.
Burn it, sell it, destroy it, like whatever.
Huh.
Give it away. But it's yours.
Okay.
So it's a little flip. That's why the mother laughs when he says that,
gotcha.
because she's recalling that's the same thing they were told.
Well, that makes more sense. That's cool. So next we get the scene I mentioned before where Gaius and Atticus go to Quintus. I got to say, maybe this is my first moment of critique. I did not care for Quintus, and I can't.
Ooh,
here's why
so much.
Here's the thing. I can't quite tell if he's a well-written character. What I mean is they've done a good job making me dislike the character. What I'm afraid is a little more going on, and perhaps I need more than one scene to say for sure. I feel a little bit like it could be I don't care for, or I didn't care in that scene for, I couldn't tell if it was the actor or the writing. But I bumped on this scene. Did not like this guy. You said I'm going to get booed. Audiences like this guy? He's a bad guy.
He's the villain that you love to hate. Everyone, he's like he's obviously the villain. Like he's a bad guy. Mm-hmm. He's a Roman mayor type governor position.
Right.
But all the people love like just his interactions with Matthew and his interactions with Jesus are just so interesting and so I think really well done.
Okay, I'll keep my judgment suspended and see what happens next.
You're coming, yeah, because I think part of it is this character's been established,
right?
And he is acting a little more upset in this scene. Of course, he's just been handed sewage water to drink,
which he seemed thrilled about. It was no big deal at all.
So.
Yeah. I mean, he was in a bad mood. They caught him on a grumpy day for sure. In this scene, I thought of you in this scene. Do you know why? They called him Dominus, which is obviously a Roman title.
Yeah.
But it's in that book we read, Red Rising, in my literature course.
Yes.
So, Pierce Brown, New York Times bestselling author, I'm sure is a big fan of our show. So, shout out to Pierce Brown. Authored this book called Red Rising, which is really good, but it incorporates some what for them is, well, I guess it's old world for us too, Roman times, but our day is many ages ago in the setting of that book. But anyways, they've sort of taken a lot of cues of how to set up society from the Romans, and so the main character gets given a position of some power, and so everybody calls him Dominus. And obviously, a lot of the other Roman names are in those books as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I introduced Jacob to this book in a class that we had, and it's the first of a trilogy, which then became two trilogies. And I just saw, you always make fun of me for how seldom I check social media. I just saw I had a message from you from like June about this. I just checked it like 2 days ago. But anyways, Jacob read this book in one of my courses, and then like 2 months later, Jacob, who arrived at this college saying, well, I don't read very much, I don't think I'm great at it, and I don't love it, was like, yeah, I finished the whole trilogy, which I still haven't even read book 2, though I loved it. And it has, audiobook-wise, one of my absolute favorite narrators, Tim Gerard Reynolds, who I'm sure is also a big fan of our podcast. Anyways, that's all besides the point. But I thought of you and Red Rising and how much you liked that series in this scene.
Yeah.
Next, we had a scene at Zebedee's house, which mostly serves to show that he's making olive oil now, and that it introduces a big through line of this episode, which has to do with Thomas and Rama. Thomas tells everybody, I'm going to propose. They have some funny Old Testament conversation, or some funny conversations about Old Testament characters who may or may not be good examples to follow in that regard. But mostly that was us learning that he's going to propose. Which, yeah? What?
Yeah, it's sort of been like really hinted, but this is probably the first time it's actually been said.
Where he like said it, yeah.
Yeah.
And he like burst out of him, right? He's
Yeah.
like, cool,
It's
olive oil, great. I'm going to propose to Rama.
Yeah. It's like he couldn't hold it. He's been holding in like this excitement and then just explodes.
Yeah. Well, that was nice. In the next scene, we've got Eden and Simon trying to return to their alone moment they tried to have in the previous episode, and this was great. This was a great scene.
I loved it.
With, I forget which other disciples, but Thomas was one of them and somebody else in another room. And
I think it's Nathan and Simon the Zealot again.
Oh, really?
They're the ones who I think arrived in the last episode.
And Thomas as well.
And so they're the ones who stayed.
Oh, not Thomas, because he's with Zebedee.
Yeah.
Okay, whatever. What you said. Yes. But yeah, so he's, boys, be quiet in your rooms. And they're sorry. It was just great.
I love the something like your food is like a good incentive for them to be quiet and listen to me.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we're quiet now.
I do like in shows where a character sort of unwittingly has to enter the mom role or the babysitter role. You know, this was sort of, I'm sure it was a thing before, but it's well established with Stranger Things. Everybody loves the character of Steve, but they always call Steve the babysitter of all the kids, you know?
Yeah.
This felt a little reminiscent of that to me. He's just like, I didn't want these grown children in the bonus bedrooms of my house, but it was nice. And, you know, I couldn't help but notice there's so much garlic hanging around her, which, of course, took me down the road of, man, vampires wouldn't come anywhere near their house, which got me thinking I'll just keep this as brief as I possibly can, but I can't not bring up, there's this short fiction author. Her name is Kelly Link. She's very beloved, writes a lot of interesting short stories. And I learned listening to an interview with her one time that she plays this sort of game with no one else, I guess, when she's watching, or friends. When she's watching TV, she will watch a show and think, what if one of these characters is secretly a vampire? And the show sort of wants me to know that, but doesn't quite come right out and say it. And she said it's great because, you know, a lot of times when you play with friends that you can sort of all agree like, oh yeah, that character doesn't go outside in the day very much, or, you know, whatever other sort of like vampire trope, which I'm not saying I'll tell you which apostle I think is the secret vampire, but it did make me think of that when I saw like, oh, that garlic, man, I know who the secret vampire hunters are on the show at least. Forgive me for that aside. I couldn't help myself. So yes, after this, Gaius and another centurion back in the tent city where Gaius, this is, you know, another, what we haven't brought up yet. We've got this growing sense that Gaius is less and less antagonistic towards the Jesus movement, whether it's because of his fondness for and relationship with Matthew, or whether it's, you know, what he heard in the Sermon on the Mount is really working on him, maybe a combination of those two things and others that I'm unfamiliar with. But you can see that he's really feeling a little bit divided in his loyalties here. And so they're walking through, and the other centurion wants to enforce more order. And Gaius just says, enforce order patiently. And I'm going home now.
Yeah.
Please finish our rounds for the night.
Yeah, I think there's that twofold because he's been sort of standoffish this episode and last episode.
Very aloof.
Where he was like quiet and he's like really just like he's got a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And he's just like, I just want to get through my job and go home.
I would like to keep my head on.
And not be killed by my boss.
That'd be great.
And Of course, Quintus sort of tells, is warned, like, do it without showing bruises.
Yeah, right.
Like don't bruise them, but do your job.
Yeah.
But there's also that like hint that there's some trouble going on at home too, which I think plays later in the season.
Okay. I'll keep an eye out. Next, we had a scene I liked a lot, which is Simon the Zealot trying to get some water from a well, which also shows us the water is not great right now. But he's, it's got that really tense thriller movie kind of a vibe where there's shadows, there's something lurking in the shadows, and there's eerie music, and it becomes clear that he's being pursued. And so he runs. And I don't know if this is inappropriate of me or not, but when he sort of like ducked into the back alley and did the sort of pulled himself up, backflip onto the roof of the thing, I thought, is this Aladdin? Am I watching Aladdin right now? Well, that's not how that song goes. I can't think of it now, but the wonderful scene, Street Rat. That's okay. So he escapes up onto a roof where Atticus meets him, and we've got more sass from Atticus, as well as continued sort of vague, threatening, ominous tone of voice.
Sounds like him.
Yeah, but he does say, "I wasn't the one hunting you down there," right? And he says, "You've left some very dangerous men in the lurch," and both of them seem pretty convinced that it is Simon's former order, the Zealots.
Yeah.
Right? You don't just stop being a zealot, and that's all right with the Zealots, who are very pro-violence.
There's actually a small hint to that early in the episode. So when Simon the Zealot is first walking through the tent city, way back into the opening of the episode, he walks past someone who's kneeling down, and it zooms down to his like hip, and he's got a knife on him.
Right.
That knife is a ceremonial knife that Simon the Zealot was wearing when we first met him.
Oh, that's the knife that he mentioned was thrown in the Jordan?
It's a knife that's like a look-alike knife.
Oh,
okay.
It's
like a set of knives. It's like,
gotcha.
I'm part of this brotherhood. Look at my knife.
Yeah.
This is proof.
Which is an interesting choice if you're trying to like not get caught by people, to have like we have a sort of branded dagger here, but we're not anybody you should be concerned about.
It's like that's what you kill the Romans with, sort of weapon. It's a ceremonial, sacred weapon type thing that Jesus throws into the river.
Yeah. This was a cool scene. I liked this scene. I wonder, what's your bead, what's your take, especially given that you know the character and the background better. Atticus sort of, in a moment of seeming desperation, says to Simon, "What is he?" Obviously referring to Jesus. I can't quite tell if this is kind of like a Nicodemus thing, right? Where he's like, I'm not supposed to be interested, but I'm super interested. Or if that's just the tactic he's taking as what is a more or less sort of undercover agent kind of thing. So do you think he's sort of playing Simon, or do you think that that's genuine? He really wants to know?
Both.
Okay.
I say both because earlier we've sort of seen this idea of like, he almost wants to see what will come from Jesus's ministry, but he's also almost like the kid who's like holding a stick that has fire on the end of it. And I'm like, I wonder what happens if I touch the curtains with this fire. He's sort of like waiting for the chaos to break, and I think that excites him because he's sort of expecting that if everyone believes this Jesus guy is the Messiah, then they're going to try to raise an army, and he gets to have fun crushing a rebellion.
Some heads. Yeah.
That's the sort of take that I've thought of it. But there is seeming to be like Jesus is playing on this idea of like, well, maybe this is different. Maybe this is different. Why isn't he inciting violence? He's very curious about Jesus. I know that much.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure what his motives are exactly yet.
Yeah. He's an interesting character. I didn't get much of him or think much of him in the first episode, but I'm now pretty intrigued to see where his story goes. Let me just mention quickly a couple of scenes before the real. Not to say these are unimportant, but the scene the show is named after, the episode's named after. We've got another Simon and Eden scene. where Simon says, let's start our family, right? Oh, let's have a baby. And then we've got Mary Magdalene, Tamar, and Rama talking. Some interesting moments here where Tamar mentions her jewelry is very personal. She can't part with it, but also is very unwilling to say anything about her past. So they're getting me with the intrigue. Every time there's a little like, what's going on there? Like I'm just like the exact audience they want because I'm like, tell me what is going on there. I don't know. And of course they discuss that Thomas is going to propose, which I felt a little bit of like, oh man, like I don't know. I'm always rooting for, in real life and movies or whatever, for it to be a total surprise when someone proposes. So I was like, oh man, she knows. But obviously, I don't know what that is in me that wants it to be a surprise. So everybody's happy, so that's great.
Yeah.
All right, so then we get to the scene with Jesus and the 12 where he says, I'm going to send you out 2 by 2. They take it about how you would guess they would, which is to say, are you serious? And I don't think we're qualified. And no, really, are you serious? There's some good humor in this scene as well. When Jesus says, look, if I was looking for professionals, I wouldn't have chosen. Well, what I mean is, that was good. But I especially liked where the guy we think is probably Nathaniel says of the Sermon on the Mount, he said, oh, you saw the best one. And he's like, I mean, they're all so good. That was great.
The look that Jesus gives him is very like when you're trying to, you've got like 3 professors in front of you and they're like, which one's your favorite? And they're just all looking at you like,
come on, man.
It's me.
It's me, right?
Your grades will suffer if it's not me.
Yeah, I did like, I mean, it was just a nice little bit of humor, but I did like Jesus' reaction was kind of like, oh, I could take a hit. And I also enjoyed making you feel bad for that. So yeah, the humor there was good. Couple of interesting lines when they're talking about the people that have followed them. Jesus says, they aren't an army, not yet, right? So we know from the Gospels that the apostles and certainly many others were somehow this whole time expecting that this was going to culminate with Jesus forming an army and physically rebelling against and expelling the Romans from Israel. And so we've known to expect that. I found this to be really interesting that Jesus explicitly says something that would have made that expectation pretty understandable, right? He says, they're not an army, not yet. Like, I can see how one of the disciples would have gotten there. Like, oh, okay, we will make them a physical army. So I thought that was an interesting line.
Yeah, because there's that line specifically gets excitement in Simon the Zealot.
Right, yeah.
He's like, I get to train these people into shape. Yeah.
Yeah, he says, not that kind of army or something. Oh, yeah, I guess that's relevant to me noticing the line. Is that what he says? Not that kind of army?
Because he's like, there are people in need of rescue or like kind of in need of guidance or something like that. And he goes like, not that kind of rescue.
Yeah, okay, you're right. There's a nice scene where Simon the Zealot again, when they're talking about, we're not qualified for this, and he says, Jesus doesn't need us, he wants us. It's good, there's good theology in that, right?
That's a heartwarming callback.
Man, I'm missing so many callbacks.
Yeah, to when Jesus calls Simon the Zealot.
Oh, okay, cool.
Right when Simon the Zealot's first brought back to camp with them, Jesus like walks with him away from everybody else. And he's like the guy who's like, okay, I'm the most military trained. I know all these like training regimens. I know how to fight. I know how to kill. I'm willing to kill. Who do you want me to kill?
Please let me kill.
And he's just like, I am ready to defend. Like I am prepared and skilled enough. And he's like, I don't need you in this group. I want you.
That's cool. That sounds awesome.
And so when he turns around and sort of says that to everybody else, and he's like, I understand now that like you don't need us to do this.
Right.
You want us to do this. And
That's
it's
cool.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And there's good theology in that too, right? The Lord accomplishes his purposes through human agents of his choosing, which often brings, can bring up a theological error, which is to say, well, Jesus needs us to account, whether it's for evangelism and missions, whether it's for, praying for somebody else to be healed or whatever might happen. There's often a question of like, does the Lord need us to accomplish his purposes? And this was just a nice way to remind us that, no, of course not. But for whatever reason having to do with his sovereign wisdom that I don't think we'll ever quite understand why he would choose messed up individuals like us. But praise the Lord that he does. Simon reminds us he wants us, not that he needs us. So that was good. I liked that a lot. All right. A couple more things here. Thomas runs into Rama outside.
Before we get to that.
What you got?
Because this ties in a little bit to that sort of scenario. Thomas runs to Jesus. Right at the end of that meeting. And he's like, hey, you're sending us out. Like, I kind of had these intentions. Yeah. And Jesus is like, dude, we're not blind. we're not that dumb. Did you notice what direction I sent you in? Yeah. And he's like, well, yeah, you sent me like southwest. Oh, that's the direction that her father lives in. That's what I figured. So he can like go do his mission and then. Yeah. So Jesus like planned that out. Right. So it's like that interaction of just like Jesus jokingly saying, hello, we all approve here. Yeah. No, that was nice. And I did wonder, insofar as Jesus, there's a few comments in the Gospels, right? The disciples left their lives behind to follow Jesus, and he says things like, you've got to leave everything to follow me, leave father, mother, brother, sister. Mm-hmm. I wondered I was like, man, this is going to get heavy if Jesus says like, no, you can't marry her because of the plans I have for you. Certainly would have been in bounds. I think that's certainly a thing that happens sometimes. But I was interested to see if that's where they were going. But they went in a perfectly happy direction that was also very nice to see. So it was cool. He goes outside, sees Rama, learns that she totally also knows what's going on. And she says, well, I'm gonna go to Joppa, where my father with the strange and funny name of Gaffney lives. And can't be making fun of people's names. Yeah, as soon as I said that, I felt bad. My name is a verb, and people have been making fun of it my whole life. So maybe that was a little internal trauma that came out sideways. I apologize. Gaffney, it's a perfectly respectable name, I'm sure. But she says, I'll go and sort of make sure this works out the way that we want it to. Which then brings us to what I think is the third main scene of the episode, very touching, between Jesus and the one they call Little James, who has an infirmity, a disability of some sort. And he says, it kind of bursts out of him, you haven't healed me yet. And I think he actually outright asks him, why haven't you? Mm-hmm. And so they discuss that. What do you think of this one? Yeah, so it's a very touching scene because you hear a lot about like, will God heal us here on earth? Why isn't he healing such and such person? Or I've prayed for healing, but I haven't gotten any healing. And I think this addresses a lot of those types of people. But it also addresses people that are just like born without limbs or legs that don't work or arms that don't work or just different things. And it's a beautiful moment where you just see this, like, there's a testimony in that. And it's hinted at. I don't remember who he's talking with, but little James in season 2 is talking around a campfire. Jesus is off doing a bunch of healing. Mm-hmm. I think it's in season 2, episode 3. And someone asks him, like, hey, why aren't like you in line? Like, why aren't you going to get healed? And he's like, well, I just don't want to feel like a burden trying to like ask him to, like, I'm only here to get healed. But you can kind of tell like it's bothering him a little bit, but he wants to push it away and ignore it. So this is sort of that fulfillment of that hint we got way early on in season 2, which sort of just compounded. We're just like, okay, you've healed all these people and you want me to heal people. Start healing people, yeah. but I'm not healed yet. But he's like, you don't have to be healed in order to do great things.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful. You don't have to be perfect to do the work.
Yeah.
You just have to be willing.
It was very touching, especially when I think of it as like strictly this scene between these two people. I thought it was, to say the Lord will do great things through you and this thing that you want healed. You don't need to be healed in order to accomplish great things that the Lord intends to accomplish through you and all of that. I thought it was very, very moving, especially to see at the end when Jesus has walked away and little James, he doesn't like burst into tears, but he's tearful and it's almost like he takes a deep breath, kind of like I was just in a cage with a lion and survived it, kind of like a kind of a nervous, like I got a burden off me. Maybe a little bit. I got a
little relief.
Yeah.
He's not in that tense situation.
Yeah. And also, I guess it's just kind of a cathartic emotion. Like, I can't believe he has chose me for this, despite what I view as these shortcomings and all that. And so I really liked it. I was very touched by it. I'm just a smidgen conflicted on if there's any extent to which I'm supposed to think of this as, and this might be unfair, I don't know, as their suggestion towards all people with injuries or disabilities or things like that who have not received healing. I wonder to what extent this is a satisfying answer to those who are awaiting healing and have not received it. You know what I mean? Which the reason I'm sort of hesitating is to say, like, it was a seemingly more than satisfying answer to little James, and I am not in any way trying to say for him or anybody else that receives Jesus's word, or well, let me be careful here. Receives what the chosen suggested could be Jesus's answer in a particular situation in which someone is not healed. For anyone who receives that and is encouraged by that, like I rejoice. But for those who more lean towards what little James said, which he said, I can recite the Song of David and say that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, but that doesn't make this any easier, which I thought was a great, very honest line. I do see how this answer could feel very difficult to say. Other people have that story, and the Lord has a different story in mind for me. I'm not saying that's false. I'm not saying I had a problem with it. I feel a little like I can't fully embrace how wonderful of an answer it is for those for whom it is a very unsatisfying answer. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It can be sort of the idea of like, that could still leave some people unsatisfied.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very interesting, gentle way to sort of remind people that God still loves them,
right? And
even if they're not healed.
Yeah.
And I think it points to the idea that, because Jesus sort of hints at the idea is like, you may not be healed here.
Right, yeah.
But there will come a day when you get your new body.
Yeah.
That Paul talks about, like that you will be healed in that body.
Yeah. I did like he says, your story is one where you'll be able to show people how to be patient with suffering here on earth because you know or you await an eternity without suffering.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a really good way to put it. So I'm certainly not trying to make any sort of critique here. Is to say, like, insofar as these two people talking, I was very moved and really liked it. When we zoom out and say, this is an answer for everybody awaiting healing, I don't dislike it. I'm just a little bit more conflicted about it.
Yeah.
But I do hope, insofar as it is true for anyone else's story and the Lord's plan for them, I do hope that it is, it gives faith and encouragement and strength. But so I guess maybe the place I can land is to say I appreciate that they included in that discussion James saying the very honest thing of like, sure, fearfully and wonderfully made, but this still sucks. You know what I mean? So I think, given the reality that we do live in this fallen world where there are the effects of sin and evil in our bodies and in really concentrated ways in lots of people's bodies, I want to be really sensitive to that and to just I don't know exactly what I'm trying to express, to say that I hope the Lord brings healing, but while one is waiting for that, and in cases in which that healing does not come on here on earth, I hope that the truth of the gospel and the hope of eternity without suffering will be a balm and an encouragement, even if it has to come in a different wording than the wording we got here. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say.
And not to drag this out much longer, because I know we need to move on. There is a wonderful conversation that Dallas Jenkins, the creator of The Chosen, has with, I'm blanking on his name. It's he goes around preaching, but he doesn't have arms and he doesn't have legs. He's got like a little nub.
His last name starts with a V.
But they have a conversation, and the big point of that conversation is, how do you move forward being born not whole? Sort of the idea of like, because little James is presented as having this issue from birth. Right. So part of that conversation is people that are born with not functioning limbs, or blind, or born with certain disabilities. And so it's the conversation of, why did God make me like that from birth? Yeah. It wasn't something that happened after birth. This is how he made me.
Right.
And so I don't know if it's on the app.
I know it was in the.
I know it was included in the live stream for episode 2.
Okay.
But I don't know if they've clipped it and put it in the extra content for the app yet.
Yeah, that seems relevant. I might need to check that out. All right. So then, final scene, we've got Matthew approaching that old home, which he has said earlier in the episode he's sort of going to donate to the ministry, and Jesus says that the women who are part of the disciples will sort of set up their HQ there. But as he's walking up, Gaius comes out. We get more evidence that Gaius really has a soft spot for his old buddy Matthew. He makes clear he'll keep Matthew's friends safe, and there's a really good line where he just said the word friends, and Matthew said, I suppose they are my friends. Oh man, that one kicked me in the chest a little bit. That was a touching moment. I need I just say touching so much. It's a moving and touching and affecting moment. Given that he was viewed as a traitor and not only disowned by his parents, or his father, but certainly lost most, if not all, of his other relationships. And so that, on top of him always feeling different, to be able to now say like, oh man, I guess you're right, I do have friends, that was big. That felt big. I was a little confused here because the other apostles start to walk up and Gaius notices them. And I heard him say, don't worry, guys, like to the apostles, explaining why Gaius is here. But he says, don't worry, guys, they're just here to eat. I was like, don't worry, guys. Oh, don't worry, Gaius. Though they're just here to eat. That one took me. It was funny. He said it so fast. All right. So then we have the apostles saying like, hey man, can y'all believe what Jesus said? And this is going to be crazy. And maybe this will be our last meal together for a little while. They mention Simon the Zealot is never afraid of anything. There's some other lines. That was just one that I caught for sure. Simon gives a little speech here. And then it ends with them in a traditional football huddle, reciting Psalm 3 together, which I thought was a really powerful ending and very cool to see. Any thoughts on that closing scene?
Yeah. So I kind of really love how Simon Peter is confronting Simon the Zealot the way he is.
Right.
Sort of very being like that's my little brother. I can yell at him for being a tax collector all I want, you don't mess with him. Because in season 2, in episode 3, again, Simon and Matthew have this big yelling match almost. And everybody, it's in a circle. Everybody's there, and everybody's kind of joining in on this sort of idea of what is going on and why was a tax collector picked.
Yeah.
And Simon is very upset at the idea that Matthew is there. He doesn't like Matthew. So to see Simon a season later protecting Matthew is very, very cool.
Yeah, that was cool.
They're sort of growing on each other a little bit.
Yeah.
Coming closer.
That's a cool moment then for him to protect, as you said, Matthew, but from someone who's going to be upset for the same reason. That was cool. Yeah. All right. Well, that is that episode. We wrapped it up. All right. Well, that's our Lucan filmography segment for today. Let's transition now to a clip of my interview with Dr. Jonathan Pennington and hear what he had to say about The Chosen's portrayal of the Sermon on the Mount and other things.
Let me just say something about The Chosen from that episode that I liked. Or that I thought about it. Again, the Beatitudes, I was glad they picked that up in the end of season 2 and then in season 3. What I especially liked about season 3, episode 1, and I would imagine that it's threaded beyond into episodes I haven't seen yet, is that the disciples are really being impacted by it in very interpersonal ways. And it was really moving. If you saw that, I think it was in 3:1 where, it is, where Matthew and Andrew and somebody else, maybe Thomas or others, I just thought it was really beautiful how they showed that these people were listening to Jesus' words, and then it was like affecting how they related to each other. So I think it's Andrew goes to Mary and quotes what Jesus had just said in the sermon about, if you have something against someone else, leave your gift to the altar before you go. And he goes to Mary and apologizes for speaking rudely and harshly and judging her before. And I just thought, not only is it really beautiful and meaningful, that is exactly the point of Jesus' teachings. And that's exactly what happened, is that they, and we, follow in his ways. And this is what actually happens when Judas, that's part of the power of that. It's episode 2, Judas comes to Jesus and starts following on that day of this sermon that was delivered. And when Jesus has this little private interview with him, this conversation, Jesus is saying, I want you to be my rabbi, which means what it meant in the ancient world to be, to follow. And that's how Jesus responds. Jesus says, do you want to follow me and do what I do and live? Let's see, how does he say it? He says that to Judas. Judas is saying that I have some education, because in this story, this version of the story, he's had some training, and Jesus says, I don't require this kind of education, even though a lot of other rabbis do, but I expect my followers to seek to be like me. I thought they nailed it. That's exactly right. I mean, that's so much better than just thinking of Jesus like we do as a teacher, like he's teaching us the truth and then we need to do it, right? Or something, obey. It's really, to be a Christian is to be a disciple of a sage, of a philosopher, of a wise person who actually lives that way and then is inviting us to live the same way. Just like Matthew 5:48, be teleos, or whole as your heavenly Father is. So, and this is this great theme of the Bible of imitation, and you see, then Paul talked this way too, doesn't he? He says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. This is the chain of discipleship that comes all the way down to us today, and this, over 2,000 years later. So I really liked that emphasis on following Jesus and then them applying his teachings, into real life relationships, and related to that it's very interpersonal, because I do think almost all of the Sermon on the Mount, especially the Beatitudes and the 5:21 or 5:17 to 48, and chapter 6 to some degree and into 7, but especially chapter 5 is very much about how to relate to other people, being a peacemaker, being poverty of spirit. I mean, that's towards God, certainly, but a lot of it has to do with how to relate to other people, and loving your enemies into chapter 5. So I think The Chosen seems to be doing a really great job of fleshing out the application into personal lives. And the little bit I've seen, I just really loved how they're developing the disciples as characters themselves who are relating to each other. We know from the Gospels they'll eventually kind of be jockeying with each other a little bit, and that's probably coming later in the show. But at this point, they're all just so sort of amazed that they're they're starting to relate to each other in more gracious ways and loving ways. And Matthew, who I gather is a pretty important character in the show, he's got a lot of shame, apparently, from being a tax collector, and he's been enemies with a lot of these people. And to see him, kind of starting to overcome some of his shame just a little bit, and to see people be gracious to him, and you can begin to see on his face that that's really changing him. That's really beautiful, and that's crucial to Christianity, but it's not often how we think about it. We often think of Christianity as Jesus teaching truth, and that kind of absolute, and that's all it is, as opposed to really Jesus inviting people to relate to one another in a different way. I just think that's really great. I'd say I wish they would have given more of the actual sermon. That's my only. Yeah. And you can't do everything, and it's okay, but it's very piecemeal. Like, it kind of jumps around and gives a couple of verses here and there. And, it's okay. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but a big part of the power of the sermon is that it is a consistent, well-structured literary message. So you do lose that. So I would say that from what I've seen, the way they treat the sermon by separating the Beatitudes and then just kind of doing these jump in and out of verses, they lose the fact that it actually was a very consistent point about interior and exterior wholeness, where the way it's presented is pretty typical, which is not quite the best, I think, which is kind of, these are like assorted, powerful sayings.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that makes the difference. And they are assorted, powerful sayings, but they're not only that, they have a point that goes together. So, that'd be my only critique. But again, it's not strong in the sense of, I recognize that. I mean, I've seen a lot of different Jesus films. When I teach the Sermon on the Mount class, I've actually over the years collected a lot of different film versions of the sermon, and I show them in class a lot of times. And they vary quite a bit on how well they treat it. And I'd say this is pretty typical on that side of treating it kind of too piecemeal, but stronger than most on the side of showing its interpersonal application. So, yep, those are my thoughts on the show. You just cut out the first 25 minutes of what we said. Just get to that. That's what you wanted, and there you go. That's my take on it. So,
all right. Well, that's a portion of our interview. Be sure to keep an eye on the podcast feed if you want to hear more. He had a lot of great things to say. We laughed, and I got laughed at least a little bit, which is, to be expected. So be on the lookout for that full interview on our podcast feed very soon. That's our show for today. Jacob, thanks so much for being with us again. Yeah, Aisha, you are missed. Listeners, thank you so much for sticking around yet again. Please send us an email at eyesopen@midsouthchristian.edu. You are welcome and encouraged to interact with us on social media, if you can find us. And hey, what would just be so great? If you would rate and review our show, that would really help us get out there to more listeners who might be interested in The Chosen nerd talking, as well as other things pertaining to screens and scriptures. So, would you share on social media this episode? Would you rate and review it as well? We would just send you so many thank yous. Have a great day.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out this podcast episode. We want to give our usual shout out to our podcast hosts. Today was Chase Hairston and Jacob Dooley. We also want to give a shout out to the band So and Tether, who did the intro and outro music. We also always want to mention that if you would like to find out more about how to get a Bible education in an environment where you can have conversations just like this one each and every day, definitely check out midsouthchristian.edu.